400,000 German soldiers died in 6 weeks during Operation Bagration, but the true cost was the realization that the Soviet army had already won the war years before the first shot of 1944 was fired.
This was not a battle won by superior machines or individual heroism. It was the catastrophic execution of a meticulously designed, formalized science of annihilation known as deep battle doctrine, or WWII operacja.
The Soviet military didn't aim to win the front line. That was a tactical distraction. Their goal, championed by theorists like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was the simultaneous, systemic destruction of the enemy's entire defensive and command infrastructure, preventing any chance of operational stabilization. It was an attack on the enemy's brain, not its limbs. Instead of massing resources for a linear breakthrough, Soviet planners hit multiple layers of the German depth all at once: forward defenses, crucial command posts, entire strategic reserves, and supply routes. The doctrine was ruthlessly simple. By the time the enemy realized the front had been breached, their rear areas had to be isolated, paralyzed, or gone. Pre-war studies calculated that a modern, industrialized army could only absorb a coordinated, multi-layered shock for a limited number of hours before its command, control, and logistics irrevocably unraveled. This mandated that decisive Soviet operations penetrate 70 to 100 kilometers into enemy territory within days, transforming local attrition contests into system-wide failures. The real impact of this methodology shattered the Wehrmacht during Bagration in the summer of 1944. The Red Army didn't just defeat frontline units of Army Group Center. They shattered the communications grid, isolated reserve formations, and paralyzed decision-making across the entire theater. The resulting loss of roughly 28 German divisions in 6 weeks was devastating, precisely because many of those units were not destroyed in direct combat. They were rendered irrelevant, cut off, and surrounded by the sheer speed and depth of the operation. German frontline commanders often genuinely believed they were holding their positions, while unbeknownst to them, Soviet mechanized columns were already operating dozens of kilometers behind them, having compromised the vital headquarters, fuel depots, and crucial escape routes. Deep battle redefined war, moving it from a static contest of positions into a dynamic struggle for control over time and space. If deep battle provided the intellectual blueprint, massed artillery was the terrifying tool that made this strategic vision physically possible. By 1943, the Red Army had transformed artillery from a support weapon into the true opening act of every major offensive. The battlefield was systematically destroyed and prepared before the infantry moved. Soviet planners concentrated thousands of guns into brutally narrow breakthrough sectors, often achieving astonishing densities of 200 to 300 artillery pieces per single kilometer of front. This was not random shelling. The fire was calculated in precise, devastating phases: initial destruction of forward defenses, intensive counter-battery fire, and finally, meticulously timed creeping barrages advancing in sync with the infantry. The scale was staggering. During the initial hours of Operation Bagration alone, the Red Army deployed over 31,000 artillery pieces. Deutsche Kommunikationen waren oft zerstättert in Minuten. Vorwärtskommandoposten waren bäricht, entteile Units waren deaf und blind, inkapabel, kohärente Orders zu erhalten, bevor der erste Sowjetsoldat einen inschmorte. This wasn't merely physical destruction, but systemic paralysis. German defensive doctrine, which relied heavily on rapid local counterattacks to seal breaches, was completely disrupted. Reserves arrived late, piecemeal, or not at all, because their movement and coordination were incinerated in the opening salvos. By 1944, Soviet artillery was quietly responsible for over half of all German battlefield casualties on the Eastern Front. Tanks garnered the glory, but it was the silent, continuous bombardment that broke resistance before the armor ever truly appeared. The goal was never to kill every defender, but to remove the enemy's critical ability to fight as a cohesive force. Once the artillery had violently crushed the surface, the Soviets deployed specialized formations created for one singular, brutal purpose: the shock army breakthrough. These purpose-built formations were designed to rupture the strongest sectors of a defense, featuring dense infantry, overwhelming numbers of combat engineers, and large allotments of heavy artillery. What defined the shock army was the precision of its employment and its relentless operational tempo. Their singular mission was not prolonged maneuver, it was to tear open the defensive crust fast enough that the defender had absolutely no chance to restore cohesion. By 1944, Soviet manuals demanded a penetration of 6 to 10 kilometers on the very first day, even against prepared defenses. During the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, shock armies smashed through complex German belts in Poland with alarming speed. German frontline units were still fighting actively, while their rear headquarters were already under direct threat. The unsettling truth about shock armies is that they were designed to impose a sudden, violent, and irreversible condition on the defender. Once the breach existed, the line was instantly reduced to disconnected, localized fragments, and the outcome was dictated purely by the achieved depth and the speed at which systemic collapse spread. Once the breakthrough was achieved, the ultimate Soviet objective was never merely to push the enemy back, which permitted organized withdrawal. It was to make organized retreat utterly impossible through large-scale operational encirclement. Fast, highly mobile forces, the tank and mechanized corps, were sent racing through the critical breach. Crucially, they drove sideways and deep, targeting highly sensitive strategic nodes, major road junctions, critical river crossings, rail hubs, and regional headquarters. Following behind, massive infantry formations would seal the pocket, preventing desperate breakout attempts. The German Army Group Center during Bagration was systematically broken apart through a series of overlapping, rapidly unfolding encirclements. The 28 divisions were primarily destroyed because they were isolated beyond any hope of recovery.
German doctrine relied on elastic defense. Soviet encirclement shattered that logic.
Once surrounded, formations lost access to fuel, ammunition, centralized artillery support, and clear orders, rapidly degrading into static, starving pockets with zero operational value. Soviet tanks, contrary to popular Western narrative, were fundamentally not designed to win duels against superior German armor. They were designed for one purpose: to end the war of movement. For the Soviet army, tanks were tools of exploitation, not breakthrough. They were assigned an aggressive role: drive deep, move relentlessly fast, and largely ignore anything that did not directly block the operational advance. Rail lines, bridges, vital supply depots, and headquarters mattered strategically far more than individual tank encounters. A typical tank corps in 1944 fielded approximately 180 to 200 tanks and could advance 40 to 70 kilometers in a single 24-hour period. During the Vistula-Oder offensive, mechanized forces advanced nearly 500 kilometers in just over 3 weeks. High tank losses were fully expected and factored into the planning. The calculation was that as long as the tanks reached operational depth, the strategic damage inflicted on the enemy command and supply lines far outweighed the cost of the lost machines. This is why the T-34's reliability and ruggedness mattered infinitely more than its armor thickness. But long before those tanks ever roared, the outcome had been quietly shaped by Maskarovka, the Soviet doctrine of strategic and operational deception. This was an institutionalized system designed to ensure the enemy prepared for the absolutely wrong battle, in the wrong location, at the wrong time. Entire formations were moved only at night. Fake radio traffic simulated non-existent armies. Dummy bridges and ersatz supply dumps were constructed in full view of enemy aerial reconnaissance. Prior to Bagration, Soviet deception successfully convinced German intelligence that the decisive offensive would fall far to the south, toward Ukraine. Crucial German armored reserves were systematically shifted away from Army Group Center, the actual target. German units often reacted days too late, committing their precious reserves after the Soviet mechanized forces were already forming the deadly encirclements. Maskarovka didn't just conceal Soviet strength, it profoundly distorted the German perception of reality. The Soviets also mastered the systematic approach to defense. By 1943, they no longer measured success in meters of ground held, but in time bought,
and enemy strength exhausted.
The defense-in-depth doctrine was revealed in terrifying maturity at the Battle of Kursk. Soviet planners constructed defensive belts stretching up to 150 kilometers deep, packed with intricate trenches and minefields. In critical sectors, the mine density reached over 1,500 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines per single kilometer of front. The immediate goal was not instantaneous stoppage, but to precisely control the enemy's advance, and at what crushing cost.
German armored units successfully penetrated the first defenses, initially believing they were succeeding, but every kilometer gained cost irreplaceable fuel, tanks, and operational tempo.
By the time fragmented German formations reached the final belts, their units were disorganized and their initial strength severely drained. Only then did the fresh, fully integrated Soviet counterattacks begin. Defense in depth transformed the battlefield into a controlled attrition machine, allowing Soviet forces to choose not only when to attack, but when to simply allow the enemy to destroy himself first. When fighting was forced into cities, Soviet forces adapted this systematic approach to close-quarters combat. The Battle of Stalingrad turned necessity into a brutal methodology. Commanders organized small, specialized assault groups, Sturmovie-Gruppe, built around submachine gunners, combat engineers with satchel charges, and flamethrower teams. Their mission was methodical destruction, isolating a structure, infiltrating it from multiple directions, and eliminating resistance floor by floor, room by room. The ubiquitous PPSH-41 submachine gun, with its 900 rounds per minute rate of fire, ruthlessly dominated the close quarters. Urban combat completely neutralized German advantages in centralized coordination and long-range firepower. Every city block consumed German time, manpower, and morale at an unsustainable rate. Cities allowed the Soviets to convert raw urban space into critical operational time, inevitably leading to the collapse of the defense. Finally, while the main armies advanced, a deep, hidden war unfolded behind German lines. Partisan warfare was a highly coordinated extension of formal Soviet military operations, meticulously supplied and directed by the High Command. Its purpose was to make sustained German defense of occupied territory impossible by targeting the arteries of modern warfare, logistics. Railways were the obsessive objective. During the summer of 1944, partisan units carried out tens of thousands of targeted rail sabotages, paralyzing German logistics at the precise moment major offensives were launched. This forced Germany to divert hundreds of thousands of combat-ready troops to rear-area security duties, soldiers desperately needed at the front. When frontline units attempted to withdraw or regroup, they often found the rail lines vanished behind them, turning attempted orderly retreat into instant chaos. Partisan warfare turned occupation itself into a strategic liability, hollowing out the German formations from behind until resistance was fragmented and exhausted before the main Soviet armies even arrived. The Red Army proved that the biggest weapon is not the tank, but the system of warfare itself. But this calculated brutality and systematic destruction often relied on the one overwhelming resource the Soviets had in endless supply: manpower. If you want to understand how the Soviets mastered this type of annihilation, you must next see the one battle where this overwhelming system nearly failed completely due to sheer German tactical genius. Next time, we break down the desperate, brilliant tactics of the Wehrmacht's final operational blitz and the single decision that changed the fate of Berlin. Click here if you dare to see the breaking point.